Shalom, everyone. Boker Tov. Rabbi Eric Solomon in Raleigh, North Carolina. Little more morning Torah. And this week's Parshat Bo from the book of Exodus. We're still in the kind of earlier chapters dealing with our leaving of Egypt and kind of just about getting ready to really all the final plagues take place, and we're about to leave the promised land through the Sea of Reeds. And as we're doing so, the question I want to raise, which has been raised many times before, is before we even leave Egypt, already the Torah is telling us how we should share the story in the future. So it's not like get out of Egypt, go through the Sea of Reeds, wandering in the desert, and say, okay, now we're free. Let's talk about how we pass this on to the next generation or future generations. Already in Egypt still. It hasn't even happened yet. And already Moses is directed through the Torah, through God, someday tell your children what happened here. This is the way it was. When they ask you questions, why do we eat matzah? You'll go back and you'll say, this because we were slaves in Egypt and when we were escaping, etc. So the timing, on the one hand, just the fact that we're not free yet, and we're already talking about the story of how it's going to be shared, the education to the next generation, on one level is a statement of confidence. You know, when you haven't won the game yet, but you have faith you're going to win, and you start saying, here's how we're going to celebrate our Super Bowl, and here's how we're going to talk about the Super Bowl game. It's not over yet. That's a sign of confidence, and maybe even a way of girding the people to be ready to succeed in a time of their fear. Right? That could be one argument. And obviously academics would argue that this was written at a different time, but let's put that to the side. I want to find a more kind of richer, spiritual or, meaningful, ethical or something to kind of life meaning to it. And the one that means the most to me, and I've talked this in other contexts, but I think it just comes so profoundly alive in this Torah portion, is that it's not just about what happened to us in Egypt. It's true. Being slaves, hundreds of years, oppression, discrimination, genocide. I mean, this is horrible. But the idea is whoever gets to tell the story about it defines the experience about it, how we tell that story. There's so many parts of this. Moshe is chosen to lead our people. Many Bnei Mitzvah talked about it. He has a speech impediment. He says, I can't do it for many reasons. He's humble, but he says, I don't speak well, right? How are you going to pick me? So one way to read the story is God picked someone to lead the people who has this defect. That's one way to tell the story. Another way to tell the story is God said to someone who has a challenge, I believe you can overcome it, not erase it, not dismiss it, not ignore it. But with your challenge, I want you to lead our people to show that people with challenges can still give their gifts and lead us. Sometimes their challenge of speaking will be the exact place where they will lead us the most profoundly. So he says, when we leave Egypt and tell you a story about Moses, be proud that Moses had a speech impediment. Don't be embarrassed about that. And let that be a message for future generations, that any human being with a challenge of whatever type it may be, that doesn't mean they're disqualified from leadership. That means possibly that they may have to work harder, different alternative paths, etc. But they will actually be able to shine and inspire. Look at the youth poet laureate from the inauguration this week. An exceptional, miraculous, beautiful piece of literature she provided, performed, created. And she has a speech challenge herself, we found out later. Kind of stutter. She spent months or weeks practicing. It's not you didn't avoid choosing her. We chose her on purpose for this challenge, to see and let her rise. Same thing about matzah. Is matzah the flat bread that we took because we don't have time to let the latzah rise, the bread rise, right? So it's flat bread. It doesn't have that juicy challah, pastry feel. It's not like a donut, if you saw my recent post, right? Is it lechem oni? Is it the lechem of halachmanya, of the poor? Is it a bread of affliction? That's the way that Seder says it in the Pesach Haggadah. Or is it lechem b'nei chorim? Because the truth is, it's also lechem of freedom. Because we ate that bread on our way to freedom. It's actually the first bread we ate when we were free. So it's either freed person's bread or it's slave bread. Both are in our tradition, to be fair. But it's about how you tell the story. When we eat the matzah, what I like to tell my kids is, this is the bread of freedom. Fine, it wasn't the most fancy bread, and it's not puffy, but it's our first taste of freedom bread. So I put this out to say it's about that story. It's about the spin, really, about how you're going to tell it. And the last thing I'll say about the whole Exodus itself, right? It's in Parshat Bo, we're going through. Do we tell the story that we're descendants of slaves, as a sense of we're slaves and we're oppressed and we're always down? Or do we tell the story of the fact that we were once oppressed, but we made it towards freedom and we can do it again? What will the story be about the insurrection? One of the saddest times in my life, certainly in a desecration of the holy temple of democracy of our country. It's horrific. But already in this moment, we can already start telling a story. Not that it was only horrific and terrible and disgusting, and yet we're still discovering, but we also overcame it. We withstood it, as President Bush said. We found a way to hold the institutional integrity, I believe the line used. That's already the spin. People put down PR. PR is bad. PR is, spin, and it's not true. And everyone's kind of, it's true. Some parts of PR are lies. I mean, that's lying. I'm not into lying. The Torah's not into lying. But there is a truth to different perspectives on how you see your challenges. Are your challenges something you're embarrassed about? Something you're ashamed of? Is it a reason why you shouldn't be chosen for greatness? Or will that challenge actually define your greatness? It's how you tell your story. It's how we tell our story. So to come back, why does the Torah already start talking about the story of the future? Because that will determine how we look at the Exodus. Is it just a source of primarily a time of suffering? Many, many more hundreds of years of suffering than the years of freedom. It was a relatively quick freedom. Because it wasn't the suffering didn't define us, or the suffering wasn't the only bad. It was a sign of our strength, of our fortitude, of our overcoming. Moses is not embarrassed because he's a speech impediment, although he's at first. In the end, it's a source of pride. Our greatest leader struggled with what he was supposed to do. So too you, future people, you will struggle. Don't hide in a corner. Bring out your gifts. That is one of the greatest messages of Parshat Bo, and the confidence of that and the importance of telling the story in an inspiring way already here. Same thing here, guys. Right now in this very challenging time in our country, vaccine, etc., it's going to be, we went through this horrific time, and we're not going to deny the horrific nature of it, and we will also overcome it. We've done it before. We are already on the path. And with God's help, we will get there. What's the story we can tell? Let's already begin thinking about it, maybe, and starting to tell it. That's how we get to the promised land. We'll never make it to the promised land if we think we can't even get to the promised land. Shabbat Shalom. Wishing everyone a safe, please God, safe Shabbat and weekend. We got to continue following all the 3 W's. And together, we'll tell a story about our greatness, even amidst our challenge. That's Parshat Bo. Shabbat Shalom.